Hi, I'm Tess Evans from Heights Heritage Conservation. I'm a textile conservator and I'm here to help you with your water-damaged textile items. These items can be anything from costumes, flags, banners, items within your home like tableware, curtains, a whole mixture of items that have textile components on them. So I'll show you roughly what you can do in a disaster situation. So in this box, in my lovely muddy water, I've got a couple of textile pieces. One of the problems with textiles is that when they're wet, generally speaking, they are less stable than when they're dry. They can be a lot weaker, and so if you're lifting something out of a bath of water like this, make sure that it's well protected. So never pick something out just sort of from one end, just in case it's very fragile.
Oh, so you mean the fibres will be really weak and you could
well
put holes in it if you weren't careful?
Absolutely, they could well be weakened. Right. I mean, these are actually in very good condition, so, but to say that, don't pick up from one corner, but try and support it under your hands.
I see.
If it's something really, really large, then you can use something to help support it, like a towel or even a fly screen or something like that. Just to help
like this fly screen we have behind us here.
So I can show how to pick something larger out of the bath.
We'll do that in a minute.
In a minute.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
So once you've got your pieces out of the water, one of the best things to do is then to just try and rinse them and rinse as much of the sort of surface muck off as possible. One of the problems with textiles, if it's not a single colour like this item, is that you could possibly have potential dyes running, and at this stage really there's not an awful lot you can do about that. It would be a case of rinsing the worst of the dirt off and then contacting a specialist conservator, but at least to sort of get them out of the water and to get them dry and reasonably clean would be the best starting point.
And would it be disastrous if you couldn't actually get it into clean water? What if you just had to get it straight out of your muddy water? I mean, if you haven't got clean water, that's all you can do really, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, I mean, one of the issues would be is if it was only part submerged. So something like a pair of curtains, if the curtains were draping into your muddy water, and the dirt had actually sort of wicked up the curtains, then it would be really important to try and actually get the whole thing wet, even if it was back into the muddy water.
Right.
But to try and stop the tide marks from forming, it would be better to keep them, or to at least get them wet and then dry them, as opposed to just trying to dry out the wet bit at the bottom.
Because the tide mark's harder to get rid of in the long term.
Exactly.
Oh, I see, I see, thank you.
So once your items have got at least most of the dirt off.
Lucky none of that's running.
None of that's running. We can just sort of remove most of it. Try not to squish too much.
Oh, okay, because of the...
Once again, in this situation, they're a strong textile, but if you had something like a silk that became weak in water, crushing it could actually cause folds and actually cracking of the fibres.
Right, right.
And then very carefully just open up your textile flat, or as flat as possible.
All right.
And then depending on your situation, either leave it to dry, air dry like that. Mm-hmm. If you have power and you can do it, then to actually speed up the process with a fan or a hairdryer blowing on it. Particularly something like this, which is two-dimensional. Two levels, I should say, 2 layers, or something like a costume. Sometimes the underlayer doesn't dry very fast, but if you have a hairdryer, you can actually blow air inside.
And would you do it like really gentle, or doesn't matter, or...?
Once again, depending on the condition of the object.
Right.
But reasonably gently, just to sort of get the air into the object.
I see.
And you'll find that as it dries, it will separate more, because obviously the water's holding the 2 layers together.
Oh, look at that. So if for example, you'd pulled that out and those particular threads, oh, that's a good idea. Those particular threads were running, like particularly with old samplers, as I recall, that's often a problem with threads, the colour runs.
Dyes run.
Would a hairdryer help with that if you got it onto, or is it sort of too late?
It's sort of too late. Basically, in that situation with a sampler, for instance, the problem is that the moisture is retained in the coloured items because they're thicker. So they're retained in there longer. So the background fabric dries out and then forms a wick for the colour, and that's what makes the colour draw out. So if that happens, that really has to be treated specialist conservator.
Right. But it's possible that they could retrieve that to a great extent.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And definitely worth salvaging.
Oh, good.
Salvaging and drying.
Yeah.
Drying obviously crucial to stop mould growth. But even cleaning is not necessary at this stage. As I say, I mean, this is still relatively grubby.
Yeah.
But that can all be treated later.
Okay.
But if mould actually grows and causes the nasty staining, that is much harder to
Much
get out.
harder.
Yeah.
So is freezing an option
Definitely.
with this? So
if you haven't got space or time to actually lay something out and get it dry, which obviously not everybody does at all, then definitely freezing is an option.
Okay.
And doesn't have to be in any particular way, just...
right, so you just fold it up
literally
and...
fold it up,
Okay.
pop it in your bag.
And it could be any old bag, really, couldn't it?
It could, although to seal it is better, to stop frostbite
Right.
on the object.
Okay. So Ziploc bag, your
A
kitchen
Ziploc bag
bags.
is great,
Yeah.
or even just a plastic bag with an elastic band around the top of it
Right.
or something like that.
Yeah. And then can you just put it in the freezer like that, or is it better to be in a box, or what's the best?
I guess it depends on what else goes in the freezer.
Right.
I mean, you don't really want to put things on top. Anything crushing on top of that will actually cause those fold lines to form.
Right. Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. So if perhaps you had books and things going into the freezer already, you could lay your textiles in their bags on top of the books.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Good. Thank you.
So that's sort of flat textiles. And then if you have costume or three-dimensional textiles, this is actually a silk which would be very, very fragile in water. So something like this, I would try and dry as flat as possible. I'm actually not going to get this wet because it is quite fragile.
Right.
But I would do the same thing. I would rinse it and then support it and try and dry it on something that has airflow. So a rack or something like that.
Right.
And once again, lie it out as flat as possible.
As flat as possible.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know with paper conservation we would focus when it's wet on using the flat of our hands, etc., rather than our fingertips. Is that a good piece of advice for textiles, or not so, or harder to do perhaps with textiles?
I think harder to do.
Yeah.
I think just careful handling.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay.
And something, I mean, if it was fragile like this and you didn't want it to be hard creases at the edges of things, then it's really good to pad out those areas. And you can use almost anything that's around.
Right.
So, for instance, some tissue, just sort of scrunched up and just carefully popped into those areas, just so that you're not forming a hard crease along the edge.
Right.
Or, say, a bit of nylon net. Net's actually really handy to have because it allows airflow through.
So you could use curtain netting or something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it doesn't hold water itself, so that so the water can just evaporate, whereas the paper towels obviously will get wet, so they'll need changing from time to time.
To avoid mould growth and stuff like that, and to help dry it, obviously.
And to help dry, yeah. So just to support those sort of areas.
And could you possibly, would that go in the body of the garment as well?
Actually down the sides.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this one's fairly full.
Yeah.
So, it could be rotated quite easily to stop any hard creases forming. But something that was heavy, for instance, like this one, which is also very fragile.
Oh, that looks rather lovely. Is that a beaded something?
It is. It's a 1920s flapper dress
Oh.
on silk
Oh, that's beautiful.
beaded. So obviously something like this, the weight in the object itself is a lot. And then if it's wet, it would become very, very fragile.
Right, so you would have to support
Would
it.
be supported
Yeah.
very, very thoroughly.
And what about the old style sequins, made of gelatin? That's a tricky question for you, Tess.
Probably dissolve.
Yes, and so they'd just become sort of a glutinous mass, or a gelatinous mass, I suppose.
Not much you could do.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
And then if you happen to have a textile that's actually in good condition and strong, then probably the best way to do is actually just hang it. So once it's been rinsed and the worst of the dirt is off, to just get an ordinary household hanger. Once again, ideally cover it in a bit of plastic so that there's no chance of the coat hanger rusting.
Oh, right, because it's a metal coat. Could you use a plastic one?
You could use
A plastic one, okay.
But if you have dry cleaner ones with the bags on, keep the bag on and then pop your object over the top, and then just hang
that's
out
a good idea.
a normal item.
Right.
Off the floor, which that's not going to be.
Okay, we'll just pretend that that's hanging off the floor. It is quite a long dress.
It is.
Yeah.
But you could also use things like racks.
Right.
So
your laundry
basically,
rack.
the idea again is airflow and dry relatively quickly.
Yeah. And if you don't have the time.
And if you don't have the time, pop it in a bag and stick it in the freezer.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
And then the only other thing is really three-dimensional objects. It's the same principle applies, but like this is a little baby's bonnet.
And what baby used that bonnet, Tess?
My baby's
bonnet.
And my baby's booties.
Beautiful.
So this would be a case of really padding it out.
And what are you using there?
So this is just tissue paper.
Okay.
Which
but you
is
could
probably going to be the easiest on hand, maybe. But once again, nylon net would be just as good, if not probably better, if you could get your hands on it.
Or paper towel, or
paper towels,
paper serviettes, anything that's absorbent.
Or even something this sort of size, something like a flannel.
Oh, right,
So toweling of some sort.
Yeah.
Basically anything absorbent to help draw the moisture a little bit faster and to give it some shape so that as it dries, it hasn't got hard creases.
Right.
Because it's the creasing of things that really will cause most of the damage.
Yeah.
Apart from soiling, obviously.
Yes. Yeah, because the creasing will damage the fibres, like break the fibres of the textile.
Can do, particularly if they're fragile anyway. Then yes, creasing will definitely cause damage.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else that we need to... I mean, I know there's not many textile conservators in Australia or in the world for that matter. So how should somebody who really maybe has salvaged their precious textiles, they've frozen them or dealt with them as best they can, and then they want a hand, who should they contact? How do they get in touch with textile conservators?
Probably the best route is to go onto the AICCM website, which has a list of conservators in private practice. If there is nobody within easy reach of your locality, then
maybe contact your major institution or something like.
Yeah, I guess yes, your local museum or institution.
But you might have to send your
It may be a case. I mean, if you
objects.
have a very large collection, then it would be worth maybe getting a conservator to you.
Yeah.
But if it's a smaller collection that's maybe postable or transportable in some way, then to courier it, talk to a conservator and then maybe courier it to the studio.
Okay. So that is aiccm.org.au, the website address.
Yep.
All right. Anything else, do you think?
I think initially that's fine.
The main thing?
The only thing I would say is because textiles are used all the time, it's very easy to become slightly complacent.
Yes.
But if you do have a heritage item please don't just stick it in the washing machine or stick it in nappy sand.
Or send it to the dry cleaners.
Or send it to the dry cleaners. If it really is a heritage item, at least seek advice before you do something.
That's excellent advice. Thank you, Tess. Thank you very much.